Our speaker today is Donald Baker. He's going to be talking about the Gwangju tragedy and how South Korea became a democracy. Please welcome Professor Donald Baker to our meeting today. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me say, I'm always glad to talk about the city as Gwangju. Sometimes you see it spelled with a G. The South Korean government has changed the way they romanize their names. I consider it my second hometown. I went to Gwangju, to Korea for the first time in 1971. I was an American then, before I got wise and moved to Canada. I was an American Peace Corps volunteer. And they sent me to Gwangju. They said, oh, you're going to suffer there in the countryside. It was a city of 500,000, but compared to Seoul, I thought it was countryside. And I lived with a Korean family for 3 years. I'm still in touch with some of the members of that family. And that's why I'm a Korean studies professor at UBC, by the way, because of my 3 years in Gwangju. I was interested in China before that. But the 3 years there, I fell in love with the city. The best food in Korea. And once they get to know you, the nicest people in Korea. They're kind of tough if they don't know you. So I want to talk about it. And I put up there, may that time never be forgotten. That's the slogan of the city of Gwangju. Because I'll talk about how in 1980, there was a massacre in the city of Gwangju at the hands of the South Korean military. And I happened to be in Korea at the time and happened to see it. And ever since, people in Gwangju have asked me to share with people what happened. And we don't want it ever be forgotten, because if it is, it might happen again. And we don't want it to ever happen again. I'll talk about, oops, I use this, right? Okay. Oh, there we go. Oops, let me go back. Okay. I want to show you where Gwangju is. Okay. It's kind of hard to read, it's not real clear. It's down in the southwest corner. Okay. That's South Korea there. This is Gwangju right here. Okay. From 1961 until 1993, South Korean government was controlled by people from here. Okay. Oh, okay. And there's regional animosity. We'll talk about that later. Gwangju was the 5th largest city in the country in 1980. It's now dropped down to 6th. It's now 1.3 million people. Okay. And again, it's known for the best food in Korea. It really is. I was lucky being sent there. I taught middle school kids English, is what I did. Okay. Now, when I got to Korea, Korea was already under a dictatorship. In 1961, a general named Park Chung-hee seized power from what he thought was a disorganized, brief democratic government. A dictator had been overthrown in 1960. There was a brief period of democracy. Park Chung-hee didn't like that, so he moved on Seoul with about 3,000 men. It was a relatively bloodless coup, 1961. He stayed in power. Actually, he ran in probably free elections twice in the 1960s, and then he changed. The original constitution gave him 2 terms. He decided to be president again, so he ran in 71, and his opponent was a man named Kim Dae-jung. I don't know if you know that name. He won the Nobel Peace Prize. And so we think Park stole that election, and he thought he was worried because he ended the elections in 1972. He declared Korean-style democracy. It became a really hard dictatorship. I have a friend whose daughter now is going to UBC, but he lives in Japan. If you met him, you'd be shocked. His face is all burnt. He was 18 years in a South Korean prison. He's a Japanese Korean. He was not political until he was arrested. He tried to kill himself because the torture was so bad. And that's why his face is all scarred up. Amazing man. Anyway, Park Chung-hee, he's the man who built up South Korea to be the economic powerhouse it is today. I have trouble teaching about him to my undergrads because as a human rights, he was horrible. But in terms of the economy, he built up the economy. He himself had grown up in a small, poor farming family, so he understood poverty. And I could literally see fewer beggars on the streets over the years. I went to Korea in 71. I came back, left to go to the University of Washington for my PhD in 74, went back in 78. And you could see the difference. It was quite amazing. So here on one hand, you had economic growth. On the other hand, you had terrible human rights abuses. The head of the Korean CIA, which is not like the American CIA, it's actually a secret police, was watching this happen in the 70s. And he was thinking, maybe we're getting rich enough now, we can afford democracy. And so at a dinner party on October 26, 1979, I'll show you this. Kim Jae-gil was his name, pulled out a gun and said to Park Chung-hee, "We've had enough of your dictatorship," and shot him dead. I was then on a U.S. government grant, a Fulbright. I got a phone call from the U.S. Embassy saying, "Stay home, the president's been incapacitated." All right. I said, they got him. But this is, they make them reenact their crime before their trial. This is the guy who shot Park Chung-hee. He had to reenact it for TV cameras before his trial. And they eventually hung him during the Gwangju Uprising that I'll talk about. Yes. Interesting fellow. He thought he was going to be the one to bring democracy to Korea, but unfortunately, he was the man over here, Chun Doo-hwan. Interesting man. Can't stand the man. I try to be objective in talking about history, but Chun Doo-hwan was then head of the army. He was actually, at first, he was a commander along the border with North Korea. He took his troops, and on December 12, 1979, his troops defending South Korea against the North Korean attack, he moved them into Seoul and attacked the Army Chief of Staff at his home. And then he made himself the head of the commission, the military commission, to investigate the assassination of Park Chung-hee. Okay. Chun, evil man, is still alive. He's being sued by the people in the city of Gwangju right now for things he said about him. Well, to see, he comes back. He becomes president later. He's incredibly corrupt and cruel. We call this a coup. This is him on TV. I remember this scene, watching it, announcing that he's going to be investigating the criminals behind the assassination of Park Chung-hee. We knew then that Kim Jae-gyo's plans to bring democracy were over. We didn't know what was going to happen, though. Oh, you can't read this, can you? Gwangju. Okay, there was Chun Doo-hwan seizes power over his military on December 12, 1979, but he promised democracy. In South Korea, the school year starts in March, winter's vacation. When school started in March and there still wasn't democracy, students started hitting the streets, demanding free elections. And it got, on May 15th, 1980, there were 100,000 students in downtown Seoul, peacefully crying out for free elections. I didn't put this on the slide, but I was watching some of these demonstrations. There's a famous rotary around the old city gate called South Gate. And I was standing on one side of the rotary, and across the street, there were some student demonstrators, and there's a hill. They call it a mountain in Korea. In BC, we call it a hill. The riot police, who were wearing like Darth Vader costumes, were pushing the demonstrators up the hill. Okay. Nobody's shooting anything except tear gas. I'm watching, and suddenly I see a city bus, passenger bus, with nobody on it except the driver, coming down the street, going around the city gate, and then ran over the riot police. I saw 5 or 6 people killed. And the bus kept going, and the students, demonstrators, grabbed the bus driver, took him off the bus to turn him over to the surviving police. They forgot to put the brake on the bus. It started rolling down the hill, and there was a guy, we didn't have cell phones then, right? A guy in a payphone booth talking. We were yelling at him. I speak Korean, yelling, "Get out of the way!" And he jumped at the last minute because the bus hit the booth, but he was out of there. 2 things were strange about that, what I saw. The newspapers the next day said there was 1 person killed. I saw bodies. I didn't go up and check their pulse. What I saw was people lying on the ground and a pickup truck, not an ambulance, come, and people throwing them on the back of the pickup truck. Why they said only 1 person died, I don't know. Maybe they were unconscious. Maybe they did survive. But the second thing was they announced the driver was from the city of Gwangju, and we never heard anything about him again. Did he have a trial? Nothing. We still don't know what happened. That was May 15th. On May 18th, the National Assembly was going to vote on May 21st to remove some of Chun Doo-hwan's power. So on May 18th, he declared nationwide martial law. He shut down the National Assembly, dissolved it, the parliament. He arrested about 800 religious leaders, 800 journalists, 800 politicians, anybody who could pose any kind of a threat to him. Okay? He'd already gotten rid of, by the way, people in the military who didn't like him. Okay? Only 1 city in Korea protested on the morning of May 18th. That was the city of Gwangju. And the reason is simple. That's Kim Dae-jung's home base, and he was the voice of democracy. He'd been kidnapped by Park Chung-hee, and they were going to kill him. They didn't then. So he was known as the voice for democracy. And Gwangju had kind of been left out in economic progress under Park Chung-hee. And so people would be hoping that Kim Dae-jung would become president, and they would share in the benefits of economic growth. In the rest of Korea, people just stayed put. Now, there were military everywhere, and there were military in Gwangju. Nevertheless, on the morning of May 18, there's a university there, a national university of that province. And universities in Korea all have fancy gates. About 200 to 300 students showed up at the gate to the campus. The campus has all been closed. All universities in the country have been closed under martial law. 200 or 300 students showed up, and they saw, looked like maybe army or police. Normally when students demonstrated, they were hit by tear gas. So the people that day expected tear gas. Okay. And so they start chanting. Kim Dae-jung had been arrested the day before. They're saying, release Kim Dae-jung, give us free elections. And the commander of this group of troops facing them picked up a megaphone and said, you have 3 minutes to disperse. But they thought, big deal, we'll get tear gas in 3 minutes. It wasn't tear gas. It was clubbings, clubs that can maim and kill. That's how the killing began. Some of the people escaped and ran downtown. And Gwangju, the street I used to live on, there's a street that on Sundays turns into a walking street, no cars allowed. And young people would put on their best clothes and try to walk up and down the street and attract members of the opposite sex. And they're doing that on Sunday morning. And suddenly we see these young people running down the street yelling, they're killing us. Nobody believed them until they saw the troops chasing them with drawn bayonets. The first killing by bayonet was that afternoon at 2 o'clock. The official story is it was a deaf man who didn't stop when the army told him to stop because he didn't hear what they were saying. We now know that it wasn't even regular army that was doing the killing. General Chun Doo-hwan sent special forces troops to Gwangju to kill unarmed civilians. Special forces, troops that are trained to fight behind North Korean lines. Why did he do that? Well, he wanted to make a point, and Gwangju was the perfect place to make that point. That you don't mess with Chun Doo-hwan. Okay, he knew there'd be opposition to a seizure of power, but he figured Gwangju was discriminated against traditionally in Korea. In fact, it still is a little bit. And so he figured he could attack that city. Also, he wanted to eliminate Kim Dae-jung as a threat. And he figured if he killed enough people in Gwangju, it would frighten the rest of the country and they would be quiet. And he was right for a few years. It worked that way. People in Gwangju didn't stay quiet. They would gather and yell at the soldiers, stop killing us, and soldiers would attack them. And we still don't have an accurate figure of the dead, by the way, because the army was stealing the bodies off the street. But finally, on May 21st, the army had taken over what was then the provincial capitol building downtown. And 50,000 people, unarmed, gathered around noontime in front of the provincial capitol building to demand the troops stop killing their people and leave. And about 1 o'clock that afternoon, as always happened in Korea, South Korea, loudspeakers started singing the South Korean national anthem. And the crowd started singing the South Korean national anthem. And the troops fired into the crowd. At first, they fired blanks. So people ran away. They said, hey, they're blanks. They're not going to kill us. They came back. It wasn't blanks the second time. They were shooting in formation in front of the provincial office building. They were shooting with snipers. They had helicopters. By the way, the helicopter story, nobody believed us for the longest time until 2 years ago. They were renovating a 10-story building across the street from where that happened. And on the 10th floor, they found 250 bullet holes of bullets that had come from above. That's helicopters. I mean, I knew at the time. Everybody who was there knew, right? But they wouldn't believe us. And that's when some young people broke into reserve army arsenals and grabbed weapons and chased the army out of town. The army surrounded the city. And the city was free from May 21st to May 27th. There were still helicopters flying overhead, firing. But the city was surrounded. But on the morning of May 27th, with American support, Chun Doo-hwan launched a full-scale assault on his fifth largest city, starting at 4 o'clock in the morning. And by 5 o'clock, he had either killed or arrested the few rebels that remained. As an historian, I'm always trying to find out exactly what happened. I'm always having to correct my stories. I was told at the time, there was a sound truck going through the streets at 4:15 in the morning, a young woman's voice saying, "Citizens of Gwangju, please come downtown and save the students." And then suddenly it stopped, and people said she was killed. And I was telling my students that for 15 years. And then about 15 years ago, I was in another part of Korea, visiting a Korean professor friend. He said, "Come with me. I want you to meet somebody." He took me to a little bar. And I walk in, and the woman running the bar addressed me in the dialect of the accent of Gwangju, which is very distinctive. She said, "I understand you were there in 1980. I said, "Yes, I was." And she says, "I understand you think the woman in the sound truck was killed." I said, "As I was told." She goes, "No, she wasn't. She was in jail with me for 5 years." So she survived. Anyway, May 27th, I mentioned how the Americans got involved. People in Gwangju still don't know what to think about the Americans. The Americans didn't like Chun Doo-hwan, but, and they thought the American documents, which we're now getting through Freedom of Information Act, show the Americans were well aware that it was Chun Doo-hwan and his troops that started the violence, that they provoked this reaction from the people of Gwangju. But they were afraid, and I've talked to the man who was ambassador at the time, they were afraid that if the Gwangju rebellion, or riot as they called it, spread, that would be an invitation to North Korea to invade. So they told Chun Doo-hwan, "We will help you recover the city on condition that you don't send any paratroopers down there. You send a regular army who are better, more disciplined. And we'll even fly the helicopters to bring them down." Chun said, "Fine." And of course, Chun put special forces on those helicopters. He lied to the Americans. So people in Gwangju are still pretty upset. At one point, during the days from the 18th and the 27th, the American fleet based in Okinawa started sailing towards the Korean Peninsula. People in Gwangju thought they were coming to help them. Now we know they were there to protect Chun Doo-hwan in case the North Koreans took advantage of the situation to invade. Okay, so why was Gwangju attacked? Well, Park Chung-hee had favored the southeastern part of Korea, so Gwangju was falling behind economically. And there was a lot of discrimination. I tell you what discrimination was like. When I first year in Korea, I went over to the eastern part of the peninsula, and I was speaking with the Gwangju accent. And one of the Koreans I was talking with said, "Where'd you learn that?" I said, "Well, I live in Gwangju." "Oh, you got to be careful. They're all thieves." I said, "I love those people," you know. And also, Chun realized Park Chung-hee had seized power in '61 with a relatively low loss of blood. Pressure for democracy had grown. Chun realized that he had to kill a lot more people to get people to accept his dictatorship. And they did. He became president for 7 years. He eventually went to jail, by the way. Mm-hmm. He was actually condemned to death, but he wasn't executed. And I'll tell you why he wasn't executed. Kim Dae-jung. Remember Kim Dae-jung, the one Chun Doo-hwan wanted to kill? In 1983, Kim Dae-jung was in exile in the United States. He'd been on death row, and pressure from the Americans got him off. He was in exile. And I met him in Seattle, spent 2 days with him. And he told me then that when he became president, he was going to do 2 things. He said, also, I should point out, he said when I become president, not if. he thought God had chosen him to save Korea for democracy. He said, when I become president, first thing I will do is stop the death penalty. He said, I think the Korean people understand. He became president in 1997. He wasn't able to change the laws, but there's never been an execution in Korea since 1997, even though the law is still in the books. Second thing he told me, which I disagreed with him about, he says, I will pardon the guys who tried to kill me, including General Chun Doo-hwan. When he was elected, Chun Doo-hwan was on death row. He went to the then president and said, I want you to pardon Chun Doo-hwan. I'm going to invite him to my inauguration. He had told me he was going to do that in '83. The reason was he wanted to stop this regional animosity. Later on, Chun Doo-hwan said, Kim Dae-jung's a great man. He tried to kill him. Anyway, but in 1980, Chun Doo-hwan figured that Gwangju was the easiest city for him to attack and get away with it. Because I can remember in Seoul, when I got back from Gwangju, I actually, thanks to my Fulbright fellowship, I had access to the American military base with their photocopy machines. So I photocopied a poem that a high school teacher had written in Gwangju during the middle of the massacre. A very powerful poem. And I photocopied many copies of the U.S. Air Force, U.S. Army Base Library, and started leaving it on buses around town in Seoul. And I would hear people say, they didn't know I knew Korean, right? I'd hear people say things like, those Gwangju people, they all deserve to die. Yeah, that's what they would say. I had to leave Korea, by the way. I couldn't stay there anymore. I was doing things, I was saying things to Korean friends that would get them in trouble. You know, I was going up to soldiers on the streets in Seoul. They had soldiers in all the major intersections. I would go up and say, why are you acting like a North Korean? So I knew I had to get out of there. I want to show you some slides. This is the gate. This is before the killing started. The students show up at the gate, and there's the soldiers there. This is a peaceful demonstration on May 16th, before the killing started. And what they're calling for is, democracy. The slogans got a little rougher later. During the 10 days of horror, one of the formative slogans was "Rip Chun Doo-hwan's head off." But at first it was simply give us free elections, treat Gwangju fairly. But this is how it turned out. The rebels eventually broke into a Jeep factory, and they stole some Jeeps. They have single-shot weapons, by the way. That's all they have. Now, all Korean men serve in the military, so they know how to shoot, but they don't have automatic weapons. We were being told in Seoul that people in Gwangju were terrorized. No. As these young men in these military Jeeps drove through town, people ran out and gave them food and water. There are only a few hundred carrying weapons. Okay? But they knew they were the reasons the military had pulled out on May 21st. This is a common scene on the streets of Gwangju. Some of them are still alive. Some people were kicked to death with paratrooper boots. I haven't been able to confirm. I'm an historian. I want to hear. I want the stories confirmed by eyewitnesses. Probably won't get an eyewitness to this. There are underground pedestrian passageways, and one of the stories we heard was that some demonstrators had run in, about 50 or so, had run into one of these underground passageways, and the military came in with flamethrowers. Now, again, never confirmed that. Many of the things we couldn't confirm, we got confirmed later, but I never confirmed that. Okay? We call this a citizens' militia. And again, it took 3 days for the people of Gwangju to start shooting back. They were being shot at for 3 days before they pick up weapons and shot back. The official dead is now recognized as the Gwangju democratization movement by the government of South Korea. The official number of dead is 289. It puzzled me for the longest time. Then I realized to have an official dead, you got to see the body. The army was stealing the bodies. That's not a rumor. A very close friend of mine, I called him my little brother. I've known him since '71. He was a doctor. He was a medical student then. The army was stealing corpses from his hospital. And they were stealing the seriously wounded. He was hiding people in closets so the army wouldn't take them. They would say, we can treat them a lot better in the army hospital. That's the last you'd hear of them. We're beginning to find mass graves after 39 years. Beginning to find them. We used to say 2,000 dead. It's probably in the 800s. Someone said to me once, well, they killed that many. Everyone who was in Gwangju at the time knows somebody who died. Yes, they do. Look at that. Unfair battle, There you got 5 Special Forces troops with the one little kid, The dead range from the ages of 2 to 80. Can I tell you some of the stories about the dead? There was a young woman who'd gone to the Christian missionary hospital, a Presbyterian missionary hospital in Gwangju. She'd gone there to donate blood for those who survived, the wounded. She was being driven back home in the hospital jeep when a helicopter overhead blew her brains out. The doctor who'd drawn blood identified her body when she came back. He was an American, by the way. A good man, Charles Huntley. How do people react in Gwangju when this is going on? There's been a lot of movies about this, by the way, and the most accurate one came out about a summer ago, and it actually won an award at the Montreal Film Festival called Taxi Driver. What you see there is what I saw. People confused. Why are they killing us? Why are they doing this? That was the attitude at first. Utter confusion. What's going on? People. And of course, news was controlled. You don't have satellite phones in, right? Cell phones. People wouldn't know. One poor guy who worked in the same province, out of the countryside, took a bus into town to see his son, not knowing what was going on. He got off the bus. Suddenly there was a demonstration around him, and he was bayoneted and died in the hospital. The doctors who treated him told me about him. So there were a lot of people. If you watch the movie, it's called The Taxi Driver. It's based on an actual incident. There was a German reporter who was based in Tokyo, and he had to. He heard about what was going on in Korea, and so he wanted to get there, and he didn't know how to get down to Gwangju. So he got this taxi driver who didn't know what was going on because the press was censored. So the taxi driver agreed to drive him down there, and you see in the movie the taxi driver slowly coming to realize what's going on. And what I like about that movie. I don't know whether they used that German guy's actual videos, because he had a video camera with him, or whether they reproduced it exactly, because it looks exactly like his films. So the violence is real. There's an earlier movie called, in English, 5/18, because it started on May 18th, which is exaggerated. It has the people teasing the soldiers. We didn't do that, I promise you. It has the leader of the student militia, citizen militia, being a retired Special Forces colonel in his 40s. No, he was 28 years old. His name was Yun Sang-won. And I'll tell you about him. He ran a bookstore for workers to get an education. He had free classes for people working in the factories. So he was known as a radical back in Korea then. A good friend of mine who worked for the Wall Street Journal, America who speaks fluent Korean, interviewed Yun on May 26th. And the army was already gathering more troops around the outskirts of the city. So my friend asked Yun, he says, "You're aware the army's getting ready to attack?" And Yun said, "Yes, I am." And Norman Tharp said, "You know they're going to kill you." And Yun said, "I know that." And Norman said, "You know, you can still escape. There's still ways to get out of the city. There's these back roads over the mountains." And Yun said to him, "If I'm not willing to give my life, people in Korea won't know how dedicated I was to democracy." My friend identified his body the next day. He was killed. I mentioned after about 3 days, people got weapons and started fighting back. There were groups of leading citizens who tried to mediate, two groups really, a more conservative group that tried to mediate between the troops and the rebels, and the more conservative group said to the rebels, "Put down your weapons and trust the military, they'll be nice when they come back," right? Well, people didn't like that. There was a more radical group, and that's where a lot of the religious people got involved. This is what I found interesting. I've been doing some research on this. Now, I've got literally thousands of pages of oral histories of people here in Gwangju at the time. And they're organized by one of, I guess you call them secular humanists, non-religious activists. And then there's Catholics and Protestants and Buddhists and so on. The only clerics who were arrested after the army recovered the city were Catholic priests. There were only 10 Catholic priests in the city at the time. There were only like 20,000 Catholics. I was puzzled by this. Why? There are Buddhist monks, but the temples are outside of the city, so they were beyond the army lines. There were Protestant pastors. Some Protestant activists were arrested, but the pastors weren't. Then I finally figured that out. The Catholic Church had the best network for smuggling out information. Priests would go to Seoul, meet Cardinal Kim, who's a wonderful man, by the way, a wonderful man, and they would give him information, which then he would give to somebody to take to Tokyo, where the Catholic Church in Tokyo would publicize it. No other religious group had that kind of international network. Mm-hmm. Something else I just found out recently. I talked about May 21st when they shot into the crowds. The priest knew that was going to happen. So 8 of them got together on the morning of May 21st, about noon, May 21st. They were going to put on their clerical garb, the kind of clothes they wear when they say Catholic Mass. And they were going to go and stand between the troops and the people. And one of the priests called the general, and the general said, "I can't guarantee your personal safety if you do that." So they were still deciding what to do, and they were debating. One priest, who later spent 2.5 years in jail, said, "I'll go check out what's going on." As he was leaving the Catholic Center, far downtown area, he heard the helicopters firing. He knew it was too late. I never got to interview him, and I was finally ready to interview him. He'd already died. As you can see, this Gwangju means a lot to me, and as an historian, I have to be objective. And so I've only written one thing about it. In fact, I wrote one article about how it's portrayed in film and literature, because I think now I'm about ready to be objective, but now the people I want to interview are dead. There we go. There were some Western and Japanese reporters. The Japanese had a video camera crew, and so did the Germans. The other Western reporters were they were print reporters. I should point out, if you see the movie, The Taxi Driver, at the end they have the army trying to chase this German reporter. They didn't do that. The reporter stayed right downtown. The army didn't want them watching the final assault, so they shot at their windows. Terry Anderson, you remember that name? He was kidnapped and held for 7 years in Lebanon. The bullet went right by his ear. He said deliberately they missed him. They were just telling him, "Don't watch what we're doing now." Mm-hmm. Another proof that they weren't really trying to get foreigners. When I left Gwangju, one of the American missionaries at the hospital gave me some x-rays to show they were using dum-dum bullets, the kind that shatter on impact. And so to get on a bus, I had to go beyond the army lines. They were still surrounding, the killing had stopped, but the army was still surrounding the city, and had to get on what's basically a country bus to go to Seoul. We were stopped 9 times at army roadblocks, 9 times. It's only like 300 kilometers. The first stop, I stupidly sat on a seat by the front door. A soldier got on with his bayonet, shoved it towards my stomach, and then he saw I was a foreigner and said, "Sorry." And then he started to check my bag, which had the x-rays, and his commander said, "Don't touch the foreigner's bag." So I was able to get up to Seoul and give those to another missionary who got him out to Tokyo, and they were going to get him to Washington, D.C., whatever happened, I don't know. So we did get information out. It wasn't easy. Okay. But I already mentioned the U.S. government decided to hold their nose and support Chun Doo-hwan. And even 20 years later, we had a meeting down at the University of Southern California. We published a book on that, Contentious Gwangju. The ambassador, I have to give him credit for this, the man who'd been ambassador at the time showed up to talk to all this, both survivors of Gwangju and scholars who studied it. And he kept calling it a riot. We said, no, Mr. Ambassador. The rioters were the military, you know. And he said, well, we said, why did you support Chun Doo-hwan? Oh, the Korean people weren't ready for democracy. I said, Mr. Ambassador, they died for democracy. They gave their last part. Anyway, so on May 27th, and it ended, I left Korea in June and moved to Japan. I couldn't handle it anymore. I didn't go back till 87 when Chun Doo-hwan was no longer president. Some of the pictures that you see, this is a child mourning a father. Again, the dead range from 2 to 80. And there's the trial. 1995, Chun and his comrade in arms named No Tae-yu were put on trial, and Chun was given death sentence. Again, he was pardoned. He now says he has no money. Right. he embezzled $1 billion back when that was real money while he was president. But at least it took us 15 years to put him on trial. But we did. There was slow progress towards democracy. I've never met Chun Doo-hwan. If I do ever meet him, I'm going to greet him in the Gwangju dialect, I promise you. How is Gwangju remembered today? Well, now they can talk about it. It's now a National Memorial Day. And there's a memorial hall. You can't see, the picture's too small. A picture of the identified dead. And if you go outside of the tombstone, they tell you the name of the person, if they're married with children, if they were a student. It gives you a little brief biography on the back of their tombstone, all 289. Yeah, it's pretty sad. This is an official memorial. They call it the May 18th Memorial Cemetery. This I don't like. You also see this as you approach that hall. There's a statue of these brave young men on the Jeep, you know, saying, wow, you know, this is, we were fighting for democracy. Now, I have to confess, I didn't meet the rebels with guns. There were only about 300 of them. I didn't meet them. But the people I met, they weren't saying, we're fighting for democracy. They said, we're fighting to stay alive. They were scared. I still remember the looks in their eyes. You never forget. My landlady, her home, actually the back wall, was the back wall of the provincial capitol building where the last rebels were killed. She heard the last shots. She said, you could tell you heard single-shot weapons, and then you heard machine guns, and then silence. She was lying on the floor the whole time, bullets flying over her. She survived. By the way, the Army is not real efficient. The way I got into Gwangju was the Army had blocked all the roads, but they didn't block the mountain paths. And so I followed a bunch of grandmas bringing in food, bags of rice, because Gwangju had been cut off totally. And following them in, I got into the city. You know, because they were, why they didn't block the mountain pass, I don't know. Maybe they didn't care about the rice really getting in that way. But that's how I got in. And things I saw that stick with you forever. There had been a young student, a university student in Seoul, and schools were closed by Chun Doo-hwan on May 18th, so he'd come home. But as a young man, the military thought he might be a rebel, so they killed him. And I remember seeing his coffin was put on a cart, was being taken out of town to be buried, and his mother was chasing after the cart, yelling, "Don't leave me, son." I'll never forget that. Also, we would recover bodies on the street, and you'd bring them. There was a judo hall downtown, kind of a gymnasium downtown, and we'd bring them there to be identified. And for some reason, it was a long line of grandmothers going in to identify the bodies. For the longest time, that puzzled me. But then finally, a Korean man explained that grandmothers in Korea are the ones who really hold the family together. Also, the grandfathers can't be seen crying. Korean men are macho. Although, I saw men cry then. A 40-year-old Korean man, very macho, said to me, I heard that young woman in the sound truck saying, come downtown and save the students. But I also heard the Army helicopter saying, anybody on the streets will be killed. So I stayed home, and he started crying. Those are my slides on Gwangju. It's because of this city that I do Korean studies. I'm not a modern historian. The man I study died in 1836. And as I said, I had trouble writing about this. I'm trying now to write about it. I don't think I've been asked to write a book. I don't know if I can handle that. I think I can write an article or two. A book may be too emotionally dry. It's when you see something like this. I mean, there was so much blood on the street, they were using fire hoses to clean it off, okay? It burns into your brain. And right now in Korea, There's a progressive government. In fact, I should point that out. There's a song that arose 2 years after 1980. Koreans believe in ghost marriages. If somebody is young, in their late teens, early 20s, and dies before they're married, you want to marry them to somebody else who died young. So they married Yoon Sang-won, the leader of the militia, to a young woman who'd been killed early on in the demonstrations. And the song for them is called, how do you translate it? Anyway, it's a very powerful, very sad song. And from 2007 to 2016, they couldn't sing that at the official memorial service for the Gwangju dead. And then a progressive got elected, a man named Moon Jae-in. And one of the first things he did was go to Gwangju on May 18th. He sang that song with the people. I was in Gwangju a month later. Boy, the mood was better. They understood their pain. So, but still, just last week, 3 members of the Korean parliament, opposition party members, Conservative Party, insisting that there were North Korean agents in Gwangju. There was North Koreans who instigated this. It was all North Korean plot. 2 arguments against that. North Korean accident's distinctive. I didn't hear it. Secondly, they had bodies. Not every single body has been identified as from that area or being a soldier from the South Korean military. If there were North Koreans, they're saying there were 600 North Koreans there. If there were North Koreans there, the army would have surely showed the body, right? Didn't happen. But to have these guys saying this it's like an insult, to those of us who were there. Now, we do know the North Koreans wanted to get there because the Americans were monitoring their communications. They were trying to figure out how to get there because it's far south. But they weren't even able to get started before Chun Doo-hwan recovered the city. So I wanted you to hear the story of Gwangju. And Korea is a democracy today, partly because of the bloodshed in Gwangju. Okay? I think Korea would have become a democracy eventually anyway in South Korea, but that accelerated it. It did. Once the news got out of what happened in Gwangju, it took a while because there was censorship for about a decade. Once the news got out, it totally delegitimized military dictatorships in South Korea. It will never happen again. So I'm very proud to be a Gwangju person because as an historian, I'm also very fortunate that I saw one of the most important events in modern Korean history. As a person, I wish I hadn't seen it. But as an historian, I'm glad I did. And I want you to appreciate, if you ever go to Korea, go to Gwangju, great food, and tell the people you understand the sacrifice they made to make South Korea the vibrant democracy it is today.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, who has the first question?